Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I used to work in the theatre, and my team would tell you that I'm completely head up about time. So let's start, shall we? My name's Hugo Leschen. I'm the CEO of the Golden Dragon Museum. Thank you for joining us this morning on this slightly delayed Loong Community Symposium. It is really, if you like, a love-in for Loong because it wraps up this extraordinary project and this extraordinary journey that we've been on. I'd like to firstly begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Jaja Loong and their elders, past and present, and their families, and their emerging leaders, and to especially welcome any Indigenous people who are here this morning. I'd like to welcome special guests, and frankly, that would be all of us, wouldn't it? First thing on a Sunday morning, I think we're all fairly special. And I'd like to acknowledge, of course, that the most important person in the room isn't in the room, and that is Loong. And on that point, these natty little lanyards that you've been given gives you free admission to the museum this afternoon. So if after the symposium you feel so motivated, and I'm sure that you will, then you'll be able to go and visit Loong and fall in love with him all over again. I'd like to thank our symposium program partners for their support in making this event possible. The Victorian Government's Living Heritage Grant Program is in a sense where it all started. The University of Melbourne Centre for Chinese Contemporary Studies provided a seed grant. The Trobe Art Institute for providing this wonderful venue. And I would comment that we've brought together 3 universities. I'm not sure what the collective pronoun is for a group of universities, but there's 3 of them involved in this symposium. That's got to be some sort of record, I would have thought. And our project team, consisting of members of the Bendigo Chinese Association, the Golden Dragon Museum, and Grimwade Conservation Services. More about all of those in due course. And of course, welcome especially to our speakers today, who will be introduced throughout the day. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. Today we'll be running 2 sessions with a break in the middle of about 50 minutes, so you can stretch your legs, powder your nose, and otherwise refresh yourself and have some lunch. Washrooms are up the stairs. There's a little orange sign. They're labelled, entirely up to you how you respond to the signage. I ask no questions. And as I've already commented, I'm a stickler for time, so we will start 50 minutes after 12:50 for the break, about 1 o'clock, I think. We anticipate concluding the symposium around 2:30, at which time you're invited to the Golden Dragon Museum. And there'll be a team from the Grimwade Conservation Services and some of my team providing a community collection care roadshow. Now, the Collection Care Roadshow is a little bit like a well-known TV program, except it doesn't authenticate or tell you about the objects. It tells you how to look after them. And one of the key messages is that you don't necessarily wrap everything in plastic and avoid blue tack at all costs. The rest of the advice I'll leave to the experts, but you get that for free. And that roadshow will run this afternoon from 3 to 5. So let's begin. In 2021, the Golden Dragon Museum was awarded funds from the Victorian Government Living Heritage Grants Program. After we'd completed a significance assessment, and it was to complete significant conservation work, but it had to be on an object listed on the Victorian Heritage Register. We, believe it or not, only have one object at present on that register, and that's Loong. We partnered with the University of Melbourne's Grimwade Conservation Services, and I'll go a little off script here because these notes were provided by Penny from Grimwade Conservation. It all started with a phone call. And Penny introduced herself as the General Manager of Grimwade Conservation Services, one of the preeminent conservation laboratories in the world, and asked me if we'd like to do a project together. And I immediately thought, would we not? And then she said we could do it on Loong because they'd done some work on the Dragon's Head at Ballarat. The Dragon's Head, we know, is older than Loong, but Loong is the oldest extant imperial processional dragon. So the opportunity to work with Penny and her team with money from the heritage grants of $133,000, I hasten to add, a significant amount, was irresistible. And to bring Loong up to tip-top condition, to conserve, not to restore, and we'll talk about that in detail, but to conserve Loong for generations to come, was an opportunity too good to miss. So we partnered with Grimway Conservation Services team to deliver what has become a conservation project of international appeal. Winner of both state and national awards here in Australia, the project has gone on to share internationally via presentations to the Getty Conservation Institute in Los Angeles last week, and later this year in Valencia in Spain at the World Conference for the International Council of Museums Committee for Conservation. I should also mention not only has it been highlighted at Getty, not only in Valencia, but it featured on the BBC News for Lunar New Year. Loong, whilst he's not moving away from Bendigo, is suddenly famous all over the world. Not only has the project delivered outstanding conservation outcomes, ensuring Loong's survival into the future, but the journey we as a collective team have delivered has provided the conservation industry with outstanding results. And so today we're here to present to you the research and conservation journey of the Loong Conservation Project. So to get things rolling, I'd like to start by handing over proceedings for our first session to the chairman of the Bendigo Chinese Association, and he's in fact president of the association and chair of the museum. Doug wears two hats. And the notes tell me he was born and bred in Bendigo, grandson of a Chinese immigrant from Canton, who became a successful market gardener at Myers Flat on the outskirts of Bendigo. During his professional career, Doug worked for 16 years in various roles with Stafford Ellison in the clothing industry, and after completing real estate studies, he started his own successful real estate company in 2001, retiring in 2016. He's been a long-standing member and past president of the Rotary Club of Bendigo Sandhurst, and has served as a member of the Bendigo Chinese Association since the 1980s, where he's been president since 2017. Doug is also chair of the National Chinese Museum of Australia, or the Golden Dragon Museum, formerly known as the Bendigo Chinese Association Museum, Inc. This organisation trades as the Golden Dragon Museum, where our dragon Loong is on permanent display. And so, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Doug Lagoon.
Thanks, Hugo, and may I also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, the Jara people, and their elders and leaders past, present and emerging. Thanks, Hugo, for the welcome, and you can tell by my bio that I'm not a historian. I'm a community member first and foremost when it comes to my links to my Chinese heritage and the history of Bendigo, and more importantly today, of course, the work surrounding our most precious object in the Golden Dragon Museum, Loong. And he is a very treasured member of our community, and as Hugo mentioned, the oldest extant imperial processional dragon in the world, and as I said, the most precious object. He's been cared for by many generations of Bendigo's Chinese families for over 100 years, and as Hugo's alluded to, on permanent display at the Golden Dragon Museum. And I suppose that's where I'll diverge from Penny's notes a little bit to say that it's that love, it's that feeling, it's that engagement with your ancestry and your past which has kept Loong in a state to be able to be preserved in his state as he is at the minute, probably in the best state he's been for many a long year. So we're very, very appreciative of what this Loong Conservation Project has meant to obviously Loong himself, the City of Bendigo, the Bendigo Chinese Association, of course, the Golden Dragon Museum. of course funded by the Victorian Government Living Heritage Program. That recognises the significance of Loong to the state of Victoria and provided funding for a team of expert conservation conservators to work alongside GDM staff and BCA volunteers to ensure his survival well into the future. And you'll get the opportunity, if you take advantage of that admission to the Golden Dragon Museum this afternoon, to have a look at Loong in the best state he's been in for many, many decades. Of course, having come to be known to the people of Bendigo since 1901, that is a very outstanding record. In fact, to last as the principal parading imperial processional dragon from 1901 through to 1970, when he was met by his predecessor, son Loong, and of course then to reappear in 2019 at the fountain in the centre of town, just down the road here in View Street, at the bottom of View Street, with these the new successor to son Loong, Daigom Loong, and that was a fantastic event and a great welcoming of and continuation of the lineage of imperial processional dragons, which has been part of the fabric of Bendigo's Easter festivities since the 1800s. Because as you'll come to learn, that the first dragon appeared in 1892, but then of course that followed on from the participation of the Chinese in Bendigo's Easter procession since 1879. And part of the ethos and part of the existence, or a very large part of the existence of the Bendigo Chinese Association, is to raise funds for local hospital, and particularly now being known as the Bendigo Health Foundation, the Chinese Association was able to make a significant donation of $26,888 prior to Christmas to launch the Bendigo Health Foundation's annual Christmas appeal this year, and that's followed on from the generosity of the Chinese community towards the hospitals of Bendigo, even back as far as 1856, where the Chinese of Bendigo contributed to the building of the first Bendigo hospital on Hospital Hill, which is somewhere around here, not in its current location. Getting back to the project, the University of Melbourne's Grimway Conservation Services team worked with local conservator Jude Shahinga, and welcome here today, Jude, and our researcher Lee McKinnon on the history of Loong and his previous repairs. And they developed a 12-month program of works to clean and repair damage to Loong's enormous 40-metre length. One of the most significant features of the project was the conservators' research and understanding of how important Loong is to our community, and you'll hear more about that this morning, and their application of that in their work. And it was great last year, and this will get mentioned a few times today, and it should be mentioned over and over again, that this project has become, as Hugo said, internationally recognised, but certainly very, very well recognised here in Victoria last year by winning the Archival Survival Award for Small Organisations in the Australian Museum and Galleries Association Victorian Awards. And I was very privileged to be there with my wife Kerry, who's not here today, but and the Grimwade and Golden Dragon Museums team to accept that award. And it's a fantastic recognition of the outstanding project that this has been. And then following on a little bit later to the Australian, I'll let Meg read out the whole name, but the AICCM Outstanding Conservation Treatment of the Year Award, which is an Australian or a national award, again for the conservation work that's been done on Loong. So it's just a fantastic project all round from start to finish, as I say, or as Hugo said, starting with that phone call from Penny to Hugo at the Golden Dragon Museum. So I'd really like to thank, well, from the outset, Penny and Holly and the team from Grimwade Conservation Services of the University of Melbourne, Hugo and the staff at the Golden Dragon Museum, and of course all the BCA volunteers who helped along the way with the cleaning works and stuff like that, and also responded to the call for Legs to move Loong from his reposition Loong in several moves within the which were required within the project, and that's really typical of the support that we get. And you'll see, if you're a local, you'll see coming up this week the call for legs for this year's Easter parade. And it's open to men and women. So you're all, and everybody. We're all inclusive down at the BCA. So this year, so we'll be calling for legs this week for the carrying of Loong. Now, Loong, of course, made his debut in 2019. Tried to make a second appearance last year after the COVID break, which was, and there was great expectations. But because of the inclement weather and the pouring rain for the previous 24, 36 hours or 24 hours, we weren't able to get Loong into the streets. We were able to make a bit of a cameo appearance at the front door of the museum, which is probably one of the most packed crowds I've seen in the precinct, with everybody with their raincoats and umbrellas and phones and cameras going like this. So there's a real expectation this year around Loong making to the streets of Bendigo on Gala Parade Day, which is Easter Sunday. So thank you, Grimwade and University of Melbourne. Thank you, Hugo and staff, and thank you to our BCA volunteers for the outstanding project that this has been and culminating in today. And I'm sure there'll be some excellent repercussions, can I say, from today as well with this Loong conservation project. And so to launch our morning session today, we'd like to discuss through the work of our first three speakers, the Chinese diaspora, the significance of our museum collections, and the importance of Loong to our community. And please welcome our three speakers this morning, Professor Kia Reeves, Dr. Sophie Couchman, and Mr. Lee McKinnon. So please welcome them. And our first speaker today is Professor Kia Reeves. Kia is a co-director of the Future Regions Research Centre at Federation University in Australia, where he's also Chair in History and Heritage. Kia is from Castlemaine, was educated in Bendigo and currently lives just outside of Daylesford. His doctoral research project explored the long-term legacies of the Chinese community in central Victoria during the second half of the 19th century. His current research works at the intersection Heritage, Cultural Tourism, Regional Studies and History. His previous principal teaching and research positions were at the University of Melbourne and Monash University. He has also held visiting research fellowships at King's College London, Clare Hall Cambridge, Utrecht University and Wakayama University, and has been a visiting researcher at the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research in Cambridge. Kia is a current member of the Public Records Advisory Council for Public Records Office Victoria, and also served 2 terms on the Heritage Council of Victoria. So what a wonderful CV that is. Please welcome Kia to the lectern for his presentation, Rethinking New Gold Mountain History, Chinese and the Physical and Historical Legacies Victorian Goldfields. Please welcome Kia.
Thanks for your warm words, Doug, and thank you for your contextual discussion about the significance of the Bendigo Chinese Association, the Golden Dragon Museum, and other kindred organisations throughout the goldfields. It's really lovely to be here. I always feel a certain sort of homecoming. And Bendigo, what a great 25 years it's had, a bit like Chinese Australian history. It's looking fantastic. So my talk today discusses the role of the Chinese on the Victorian goldfields during the second half of the 19th century. I'd like to also just informally consider how the Chinese had a role as part of the Victorian rushes, a major one, as I'm going to say, the transformational role of the gold discoveries on Victoria. They were immense and continue to have implications into the present day. The development of distinctive goldfields towns, I should have written cities in the abstract, Bendigo, the icon, Ballarat, the other cousin, and then the smaller but significant places, Castlemaine, Beechworth, Stawell, Ararat, Avoca, arguably even towns along the Murray that tie in with the gold rush experience. I might have missed one, I'm from a smaller town, excuse me if I have. There are also a number of allied industries that emerge as part of the development of the rushes. The obvious ones, I think,
are in agriculture, horticulture. Doug, you mentioned your family's roots. I'm also thinking of a former brief Vice-Chancellor, Kwong Lee Dow. His family also were market gardeners along the water meadows that provided so much of the nutrition and food for so much of a burgeoning goldfields or indeed Victorian population. There's also viticulture as well, which I'll close on as just a bit of a soft touch to provide the broader longitudinal implications of the Chinese gold settling experience. So, and yes, I'd just like to just finish on that. And the reason I mentioned viticulture is just to say it's just not just gold, it diversifies very quickly. There's roles in medicine as well. So these are just a few of the long-term legacies that continue into the present day. And the point of my presentation is to provide a broad-ranging historical synthesised overview to the more technical material culture and curatorial themes that understandably and importantly dominate and run through this symposium. So my main point, argument if you like, is that there are a number of different pathways or approaches for understanding the patchwork nature of 19th century goldfield society. This might include looking at material culture and the wonderful conservation of Loong. It might involve family history, it might involve archival records, it might involve art, it might involve landscapes, it might involve historical archaeology, it might involve a whole lot of things. I think altogether that's how we can put together the story. It might involve traditional archival records, of course. And I'd suggest that conserving and understanding Loong is a pathway back to understanding a rich history of Central Victorian goldfields that has always been multicultural. That last word I mentioned quite deliberately. We came to the Golden Dragon Museum in the 1980s, and it wasn't a surprise to me there were Chinese communities. They always have been in my imagination since I was 12 years old, even earlier through family connections. We knew Jara people, and I went to school in Castlemaine with Italian Australians or Swiss and Italians who'd been here for 5 or 6 generations by the time I arrived, certainly longer than my Irish Catholic family in the region. So who is a pioneer? What is multicultural? What does it mean for our regional communities? I just put that in the back of your head. It's not the point of today, but it's important to consider. I'd also like to now just quickly do a shout out to the Bendigo Chinese Association, the Golden Dragon Museum, for the longitudinal work of maintaining and also promoting and celebrating the Chinese Australian experience and also Chinese culture. I'd also like to recognise other kindred organisations, since the reinstituted CAFOB, who are doing family history, and there are a number of others that I won't mention now. I think it's also important, just for the purposes of today, to recognise the role of Penny and the team at the Grimwade, to reiterate what was said in the opening comments, and also just acknowledge there are many discrete regional Chinese communities throughout Australia that need recognition and have played a huge role in the not just the peopling, but the cultural and economic life of a huge part of southeastern Australia, indeed the country. So, when I first came to research the 19th and early 20th century Chinese on the Victorian diggings, I encountered a cultural landscape radically transformed by the surface or alluvial mining during the 1850s and 60s. I also encountered a group of people whose role in the history of the Central Victorian region had largely been distorted or forgotten. Thankfully, the work of many people in the last 2 decades, and I include Lee, who's talking, and Sophie amongst this, has addressed those shortchanging, if you like, of the role of the Chinese. However, when I first came to it, there was a gap, but there were cultural markers in the past that remained in the disturbed and complicated landscape. Like S.T. Gill before us, many of us know we are well on the way to the Central Victorian goldfields that kick-started modern Australian history when we round Mount Macedon. And then we continue on through the Black Forest. For me, the moment used to occur when I trawled through the mining settlement of Malmesbury, always slowing down because the guy got an Order of Australia for issuing speeding fines, and passing a series of Victorian bluestone buildings on the way there. And I'd continued over the rise until the mining vista revealed itself in its entirety, the Alexander diggings. And before me was a heavy wooded area that was once the Central Victorian diggings, now a national park, and revealed in its full extent, framed in the distance by the imposing mount from which the district takes its name. Today, Malmesbury is bypassed. It's the main road to Bendigo, of course. And many bypass Castlemaine, my destination, continue up the goldfields for a highway of the Calder that now slices across the country to the great inland city, of Bendigo. Here we are. And what Others, for instance, might head the other way out the Western Highway to Ballarat, Ararat and Stawell, or track towards Avoca, Talbot and Maryborough. All of us who make these journeys have points of reference that are a response to the landscape and the history that it contains. This is my university, by the way. It used to be a gold mine. I'm just putting on a bit of colour. It's the only picture you're going to see of Ballarat today. But I just want to provide a bit of broader context because we're going to get granular about Bendigo, the Chinese and Loong, of course, but just this is about the bigger picture. For the gold seekers of the 1850s and 1860s, these well-travelled routes would have been the final and most arduous part of their journey to the Central Victorian goldfields. The Central Victorian goldfields, after all, were the greatest shallow alluvial diggings the world has known. The scale of the rushes and the potential of winning gold there had triggered a global mass movement of people to Australia. Among them were the Chinese gold seekers, the largest group of non-English speaking diggers on the Australian goldfields. Their journey along these now forgotten roads serves as a metaphor for their place in the historical landscape, in which to a large extent they have been historically hidden and buried for much of the 20th century, only to come back with a force in the last few decades. And I'm mindful I never went away in Bendigo. So my initial confusion about how to best interpret this remnant landscape for its cultural significance matches that of the gold seekers who first encountered the Australian with here, and its people would have been on the road to the diggings. Equally started as myself were those who recently arrived from the southern China ports of Guangzhou, Hong Kong and Macau. These men, most of whom spoke little or no English, directly faced the challenges of coming to terms with a landscape broken by mining and colonised by a disparate society that was still coming to terms with its own experiences and opportunities. So, the Chinese in the goldfields, and I think Loong is testament to it, as is the BCA, were not all merely sojourners. While it's true that many returned to China either voluntarily or as a result of state pressure from colonial authorities, I think it's important that we examine the continuing history of the goldfields generation of Chinese and their descendants in Australia. History that continued well into the 20th century and legacies endure right up to the present day. Part of the reason I think we are here today. And I guess my aim here is to reiterate the opening point that I think the Chinese role in Australian society or for Australian history is as settlers rather than as sojourners. So reinscribing the Chinese back into the historical record is not simply an attempt to allay past or present-day historical sensibilities. It might reflect my politics. It's actually a historical fact. But instead, I want to offer a far more complex history that has perhaps previously not been understood. On one hand, there are moments of racism and hostility, others of cooperation and friendship. And I think in the Easter Fair and Loong, we have the cooperation and friendship narrative at the fore. And I think it's important we can do this by telling stories or histories that we can reconstruct the past. We can look at landscape, we can look at Loong, we can understand the Bendigo Easter Fair, we can think about a whole lot of different families that endure, have been here for a number of times, had major success, and that's really the point of looking at the Chinese experience as a legacy of the gold rushes. So just going back, in 1851, the Chancellor, Edmund Hammond Hargraves, the 49er, he discovered gold at Ophir in New South Wales. And a year later, gold was discovered in the newly formed colony of Victoria, pretty much a place at the periphery of the British Empire, very few people, more sheep, and dominated by the squattocracy. This is before even the square mile run. This is before their very large holdings. Where I live in Smeaton, I think had a 32,000 acre sheep run. For a property that size in the goldfields today, it seems just unbelievable, but it's the case. It was pretty irrelevant, I think, until the discovery of gold. The gold discoveries triggered then another stage of global gold seeking. For the 49 rushes eventually played out and prompted one of the great migrations of the century. The people who came to the Antipodes, and to Victoria in particular, represented a cosmopolitan and multicultural group. Most came from the British Isles, but the largest minority, perhaps 35,000, came from China, primarily from the Pearl River Delta region in southern China. I know that's a qualified term, Pearl River Delta, but I'm just using a geographical signature. So it's worth reiterating that the story of the Chinese and also the Chinese-European encounter on the goldfields is a layered one, typified by sometimes paradoxical social relations. We saw that great opening slide of the Bendigo Easter Fair and then my terrible one of Castlemaine. I'm sorry, I really should have a sharper resolution. Sorry, Penny. But once again, this is His Royal Highness visiting Castlemaine with the Chinese community leading the procession. Yeah, so I think what we see here is that that these communities that are dotted throughout the region, their history has not been fully considered. Some places it's been really fleshed out, others it's little known about. There isn't a discrete Chinese community in Castlemaine or the equivalent of the Bendigo Chinese Association, so that history isn't as well known and it happens through different things. So what that means in my childhood hometown, and Sophie will know this more than anybody, the otherwise laudable cultural institution such as the Castlemaine Gallery Museum, contained a smattering of material culture that in some respects was factually incorrect in its interpretation and tenuous in its provenance. But what is more telling is that the Chinese community are often absent from local community memory of the gold rush, despite having played such an important part of creating it. And this is Daintree's picture of gold mining at the Chinese encampment near Guildford, and they're paddocking, they're taking out sections at a time. It's quite an amazingly efficient way of mineral extraction. And that's on the road between Campbell's Creek and to Guildford, for those who know that part of the world. So the significance of the Victorian diggings as a key area of understanding the Chinese experience in the Pacific ultimately needs to be explained in the terms of gold. Chain migration patterns that drew so many to the Australian goldfields occurred because of familiar cultural and economic pathways that were opened up by the discovery of large alluvial gold deposits in central Victoria. I know Central, Deborah, I know the deep lead happened, Bendigo went on and on forever, it's an extraordinary story, but it did have that initial gold rush. There was lots of rich alluvial gold before the company mining came to Bendigo, and it went on and became a great inland city. Castlemaine didn't have the deep leads, it just sort of stopped. It was a nice place, about 8,000 people, had rich alluvial mining, and Ballarat went very quickly to deep lead alluvial mining and has very much a company town feel about it in that respect. So in essence, I'm suggesting that gold was the initial catalyst for attracting the movement of people. It was a conduit and an enabler rather than a democratic mineral. The chain patterns developed in response to the demands of the goldfields. In this respect, the dynamics of the pull factors that sustained immigration were essentially the same for the Chinese as they were for the Welsh or any other minority communities that ventured to the Victorian diggings. People came to win gold, have autonomy, make their future. It is the pathways and chain migratory patterns that facilitate such movements. For the Chinese who came to Australia, these migration patterns were based on regional associations, particularly in the localities of Toshan, Siyap, and Samyup in southern China. Regional associations were in turn reinforced by labour recruiting mechanisms. It was these migratory patterns that led the Chinese not only to the Australian colonies, but also to other regions throughout the Pacific Rim. It also suggests that the process of migration involves more than the consideration of a single destination. Chinese immigrants travelled to and fro the various goldfields on the Pacific Rim, with Castlemaine, Bendigo, Ballarat, Gamsam, representing a key point of Chinese settlement in a broader pattern. Considering the Chinese experience of the goldfield societies of the Pacific Rim requires a dynamic notion of the movement of people. Likewise, the complex associations that people form with the countries in which they live cannot be explained by a static notion of belonging. We can belong to Bendigo, we can belong to Victoria, we can live overseas, we can belong there. It's a fluid thing, I'd suggest. And people belong to different communities during the course of their lives. Thinking about the history of the Chinese and the diggings just demonstrates how the paradoxical nature of the colonial gold-seeking era can only be understood by considering all these historical voices, using all the sources that comprised digging society. The Chinese were an integral part of this society and cannot be understood as historical witnesses to the era at a remove from the major events that dominated Victorian life for 2 decades. Victorian history has tended to emphasise the gold rushes south of the Great Dividing Range. Yet in alluvial terms, where the big money was won early, all of these goldfields were incidental to the really great rushes that happened in Bendigo, Castlemaine, the Ovens Valley, all located or situated to the north of the divide, the inland corridor, if you like. It's drier up here. By emphasising places like smaller places like Avoca, Talbot, Clunes, Chiltern, Majorca, Ravenswood, Ophir, near Rutherglen, or Allendale, I think new perspectives emerge and tell a even richer story of the role of the Chinese throughout the region. I'm just very mindful of time, so I'm just going to finish up. I mentioned the ancillary industries, and the point of this is really to highlight this enduring legacy. I'm not going to go into detail, but market gardening did provide nutrition and a level of intensive horticulture or agriculture that fed and arguably provided a huge amount of nutrition to a rapidly burgeoning society that in 1851 I think has about 35,000 people. A decade later it's 10 times the size. So can you just imagine if Bendigo had 1 million people in 10 years' time, how you deal with that? Who feeds these people? What are the alternative medicines if you can't get to a doctor? What's the role of the Chinese apothecary? And who's going to do the heavy lift on things like establishing the food and beverage industry, or say viticulture, winemaking? Great Western has it has incredible drives, an amazing chateau, if you like a European chateau. A lot of the work that was done at Great Western was done by Chinese people, not just labourers, but actually working in the industry as well. That's even more so the case up in Rutherglen, where I've been doing research. This is in the northeast of Victoria, and it's not just about planting vines, the back-breaking work, it's also in the winemaking process as well from the very earliest of times, and it's not in those initial decades, it continues on until the turn of the century, suggesting a much longer and complex relationship with what is in some respects one of the core regional industries in Victoria today, winemaking. And I put up this image of Burgoyne's at this incredible Mount Ophir, which has had millions of dollars spent on it, as an example of this broader connection. Most people are attracted by gold, it diversifies pretty quickly, the rushes pass, people stick around, they do a number of different things, and I'd suggest to you that, just to close, that the legacy of Loong can be understood in a broader historical tableau. I've just tried to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour for. I know Loong's material culture, I know Loong belongs to Bendigo, I know Loong has incredible resonance and probably is one, not only the oldest, but probably has huge implications in terms of touching back after the Cultural Revolution. I understand that the older dragons were needed to get patterns and that back in China, so it's maybe a case of reverse cycle, if you like. If we look at the gold rushes from, say, 1851 to 52 when the Chinese arrived, and then see it in a long-run perspective, I think Loong serves as an exemplar to the rich history of the gold rushes, the role of the Bendigo Chinese community as through the Easter Fair, through the March, through the BCA, and just the broader discussion about the huge significance of the Chinese contribution to Victorian and Southeastern Australian society for the past 170 years. I'll leave it there. I'd just also like to finish on the question, well, who is a pioneer? Clearly the Chinese in Bendigo are. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Keir. And we'll have a little, I think Hugo mentioned, we'll have a Q&A at the end of the first of the morning session, and you'll be able to ask questions of Keir and our following speakers as well. To follow on from Keir, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Sophie Couchman. Sophie is a professional historian and curator who works closely with communities to tell their stories. She's researched and published in the field of Chinese Australian history and has been involved in the development of historical projects such as exhibitions, walking tours, oral histories and online resources for many years. She has recently completed a significance assessment report for the Golden Dragon Museum. Thank you very much, it's fantastic, on the collection, and has worked as a research curator for the current exhibition, which has just finished up over at the Bendigo Art Gallery, but the Treasures of Diagram Sound, which was really very, very well received by both locals and visitors. And that finished up a couple of weeks ago, or a week or so ago. Please welcome Sophie for her presentation, Understanding the Significance of Loong and the Collection of Bendigo's Golden Dragon Museum. Please, Brooke.
Thank you, Doug. I'm going to be whizzing through a whole lot of photos here. Hopefully they'll stay in order. I'm not going to be talking about a lot of them, so they're to give you a sense of the collection. I'd like to start by recognising that the Chinese Australians we're discussing today, while often enduring the harsh exclusion from mainstream white Australia, were nevertheless deeply implicated in the dispossession of First Nations people from their country. And this includes the traditional lands of the Jara people of the Kulin Nation here today. And I say this recognising that my ancestors also had a role in the colonising of Australia. And I look forward to the day when, as a nation, we can find ways to come together to address this unresolved issue at the core of our nation, which, as a historian, I find more and more apparent the more work I do. Addressing a whole museum collection is challenging for one person. As someone commented in response to my appointment to prepare the Golden Dragon Museum's significance assessment, wonder who this expert is. The collection at the Golden Dragon Museum is very diverse, from cotton, brocade, to silk garments, to porcelain wares, to cloisonne wares, wood carvings, jade artefacts, and so on. To be an expert in all these is quite an achievement. In fact, the collection's much more diverse than even this. It also includes printed and manuscript materials, audio-visual material, photographic items, as well as an extensive research library and archive, all in multiple languages. 3 overlapping themes link the museum's collection: Bendigo's ongoing dragon procession culture, a social history collection covering the diverse and changing lives of Chinese Australian families and community, and collections of Chinese fine and decorative art. Now, I'm the first to admit that in some senses this person's observation is absolutely correct. I'm not an art historian, I'm not an art valuer, I'm not a conservator. I am, however, a social history curator and historian, as Doug mentioned, with expertise in Chinese Australian history. My assessment is, of course, shaped by this fact, but I think that significance assessments, while they draw on specialist detail, they also take a broader perspective, and they offer a guide to museums to better understand their collection. Now, of course, the people who work in these collecting institutions, people like Lee McKinnon, who'll speak next, already have an incredibly deep knowledge about their collections and the stories that they tell. The reason why assessments are usually undertaken by someone like me, who's outside the organisation, is that this helps the organisation to see itself through different eyes. Writing a good significance assessment draws on the expertise that's already present in the organisation. So, what is a significance assessment, and how do you assess the significance of a whole collection? Significance is a museum concept that aims to capture why something is important. Why is it special? Why is it worthy of keeping? In essence, why is it significant? In 2009, Rosalind Russell and Kylie Winkworth developed a framework to guide the assessment of significance in museums. They broke significance down into 4 main characteristics: historic significance, artistic or aesthetic significance, scientific or research significance, social or spiritual significance. They then further identified 5 characteristics that modify, that kind of strengthen or weaken these primary characteristics. Provenance: how much do you know about the life of the object? Who made it? Who used it? Where and when? Its rarity, its representativeness. Is it a good example of a common thing? Its condition or completeness. Is it damaged? Is it part of a set that's intact? And finally, its interpretive capacity. What stories does it help us to tell? So you can assess the significance of individual objects, and museums do that when they accept items into their collections, or in this case, the more challenging task of assessing a whole collection. Now, in my experience, most collecting organisations actually have a pretty good idea about what it is that's significant about their collections. What the assessment does is articulate why and how an organisation's collections might be significant. And this gives these organisations an opportunity to reflect on the strengths and weaknesses of what they have and how they manage and interpret them. Understanding the significance of a collection involves understanding the history of the museum and how its collection has evolved over time, the museum's place in the community and stakeholders associated with it, how its collection compares with other similar collecting institutions and their collections, the condition of the collection and how it's being cared for, how the collection has been used and interpreted. Undertaking an assessment involves visiting and examining the collection, both on display and in storage, generally more than once, identifying methods used to catalogue and document it, speaking with current and former staff members and volunteers, to researchers and other stakeholders. Undertaking broader research and reading about the history of the organisation and its collection and the stories it tells. And finally, researching other collections. Museums and collections, I think, are really important to people, and we're all here today, I think, as a bit of a testament to that. They are, as museum professional Bill Storer has noted, testimony to people's lived history and emblems of community memory. Significance assessments are about revealing this, and in some senses, I think, reflecting on the character of a museum and its collection, its kind of personality. Now, my full significance assessment report, which is quite long, is for operational use, but you can read the two-page significance assessment that I wrote on the Golden Dragon Museum's website. What I want to do today now is to highlight some of the key reasons why the Golden Dragon Museum and its collection draws such affection, loyalty and support that we've heard already today from visitors, not just locally, but nationally and also internationally. So let's unpick some of this significance. Now, I think that there are two foundational histories about Australia that resonate overseas, that is part of the museum and its collection's historical and research significance. And this relates to the transformational impact, firstly, of the gold rushes and secondly, of immigration in Australia. Chinese people have, of course, had a key place in both these histories of Australia, and I would say almost fundamental. So firstly, the gold rushes. Now, as these talks kind of actually fit together very well. So as Kia has just highlighted, Bendigo's gold rushes were a really important part of Victoria's gold rushes and in turn Australia's, and their repercussions were profound and ongoing. Prospectors who arrived from the Pearl River Delta area in southern China were central to the goldfield story across Australia, and were also part of gold rushes in other parts of the world, such as New Zealand, California and British Columbia. The museum collection helps us to see this gold rush story through its collection and through the research and the tangible and intangible cultural heritage that it has. Now, secondly, immigration. After its invasion by the British, Australia's history has been one shaped by immigrants and attempts to control that immigration. The Cantonese prospectors who arrived during the gold rushes, those who followed in the 19th and early 20th century and their families, were the first significant non-white immigrant group to arrive in colonial Australia. How Australia responded to these arrivals and their descendants over time shaped how Australians responded to later non-white and particularly Asian immigrants. Responses included the passing of racially discriminatory legislation that restricted Chinese movement, some of the first in the world. Other laws denied Chinese naturalisation and the full rights of citizenship, and further legislation constrained their employment opportunities. Chinese arrivals to Australia encountered violence, exclusion, and casual racism, but they were also met with curiosity, admiration, friendship, and even love. Cross-cultural engagement is multifaceted, and people's responses to it varied. Chinese immigration to Australia is also part of a much larger global immigration story. 20 million Chinese people are estimated to have emigrated from China, largely southern China, over 100 years between 1840 and 1940. Around 90% of them went to Southeast Asia. Now, the characteristics of Cantonese migration to and settlement in Bendigo are echoed across the world, all uniquely shaped by the places that received them. The ongoing migration of people with Chinese ancestry to Australia, now much more diverse and complex than it was in the 19th century, and the rise of the People's Republic of China as a global power means stories about the lives and experiences of Chinese people in Australia have a really strong and ongoing continuing relevance. The museum holds collections related to Chinese Australians from across Victoria and to a lesser extent Australia. Its strength and significance, however, I believe comes from the depth and sophistication of the history it can tell about Bendigo's Chinese communities. By doing this well, it has the potential to illuminate and add insight into other Chinese diasporic histories. The museum holds a diverse and extensive collection of rare and commonplace objects, textiles, photographs, documents and oral histories that relate to Chinese family and community lives in Bendigo and those of their descendants. This is supported by an impressive research archive and library. The knowledge and experience of staff and volunteers since the museum's founding and throughout have greatly enhanced this already considerable significance. So now I want to talk about place. So the location of the museum also adds to the social and historical significance of its collection. After many years planning, the Golden Dragon Museum was established in Bridge Street in 1991. This part of Bridge Street has a history of Chinese occupation that dates back to at least 1856, when it was home to Chinese stores and refreshment rooms. From the 1870s, as the gold rushes waned and people who lived on the goldfields moved into cities and towns, the area increasingly became an important commercial and social hub. It was home to individuals and families, grocers, general stores, tea importers, herbalists, opium dealers, gambling rooms, and key community organisations. When nearby Ironbark Camp, now Emu Point, was gutted by fire in 1911, important businesses and organisations relocated to Bridge Street, as did Loong and his regalia. This regalia was stored in a shed behind the general store Sun Kim Chong, and this building was later occupied by the Bendigo Chinese Association, who eventually took over management of the Chinese contribution to what is now called the Bendigo Easter Festival. The Bendigo Chinese Association, known in Cantonese as Changhua Gonghui, was established around 1914 with the encouragement and support of China's new Republican government. It's one of many Changhua associations established across the Chinese diaspora at that time that sought to unite overseas Chinese. These organisations brought together Chinese from different districts of origin, different clans, and, at least in theory, different political and religious affiliations. The Chinese community in Bendigo was actually already engaging in this sort of cross-social collaboration in order to contribute to the Bendigo Easter Festival. Today, many Chinese Bendigonians have links to Bridge Street, its businesses and associations, and this gives the area a really special social significance. Its proximity to the former Sandhurst Cemetery and the preservation and planting of the pomelo used in dragon and lion awakening ceremonies gives the area an added spiritual significance. And so now what I want to reflect on is, and finish with, is some brief reflections. Actually, it's not that brief, it turns out, on the symbolism and spiritual significance of the Chinese contribution to Bendigo's Easter Festival. And I'll just touch on this because I know Lee is going to go into this in more detail next. For me, this was about, I've been very aware that there's something, I call it almost magical, about the Golden Dragon Museum. It elicits something in people that captivates them in a particular way, and I wanted to explore as part of the significance assessment what this was. So the Chinese community of Bendigo and beyond have contributed almost without a break to the street parade held as part of Bendigo's Easter Festival since 1871. Processional dragons, dancing lions, costumes and other regalia were imported to Bendigo from southern China and Hong Kong at various times over the last 150 years. The parade was used to raise funds for the Bendigo Hospital and Benevolent Asylum. Now, in participating, Chinese Bendigonians asserted their presence and earned the respect of the local community. They contributed to civic and community life, and they helped to ensure that their community would be well looked after by the hospital when needed. The Chinese Bendigonian contribution to the parade is celebrated as a Chinese thing, and it certainly draws on 19th century Cantonese cultural practices and is part of a culture of dragon processions created by diasporic Cantonese communities around the world. But I would argue that these practices were adapted to meet the specific needs of Bendigo's Chinese community, and that they have transformed over time into a unique contemporary Australian event. There may be processions that look like this in southern China, but their function and their meaning are different. Today, the Chinese Bendigonian contribution to the parade has acquired much deeper levels of symbolism and has become an important social and spiritual event for Chinese Australian communities nationally. The longevity of Chinese participation in the parade has become symbolic of Chinese Australian achievements and endurance in the face of discrimination. As a result, the parade holds a special place in the local area that extends to other parts of regional Victoria. Non-Chinese communities are proud to see the endurance of Chinese traditions from gold rush times and to have something positive survive from the era of white Australia. The parade, let's face it, is beautiful and spectacular, and the wider community is generally proud to have a community who've been able to maintain this special tradition. The dragons, lions and regalia live at the museum, and so the ceremony that spiritually awakens them is undertaken at the museum. The parade starts and ends at the museum. A select group participate in the awakening ceremony, but many crowd outside, as Doug mentioned, waiting to see the dragon and the lions emerge. The parade has long attracted participants and attendees from Melbourne, but today lion troops also travel from Darwin to participate in the parade, and Chinese Australians from all over Australia travel to Bendigo to be part of the spectacle. A colleague of mine who now lives in Sydney, who's from Taiwan, comes to view the parade. International Chinese visitors also feel the power of this symbolism. For some, the procession is a reminder of Cantonese social and spiritual practices, suppressed and largely lost during the Cultural Revolution. International lion dancing and Cantonese opera troupes visit the collection to connect with this historic cultural legacy. For many Chinese Australians, attending the parade is also deeply personal. Families gather and meet with friends to participate in small personal rituals. They meet at a particular location before the parade. They go to particular restaurants, they eat certain foods. There's a Chinese cultural tradition of returning to home villages to celebrate Chinese New Year with family. Family gatherings in Bendigo during the Easter festival, I think, have some of the resonances of this deep cultural practice. And as Anita Jack explained to me, the spiritual significance of the museum and the Easter festival is also enhanced because visitors can pay their respects to ancestors. This can be done at the Bendigo Joss House Temple, the Jigong Tong, the last surviving building from the old Chinese ironbark camp and one of the few surviving Joss houses in a former Chinese Victorian gold rush community. Ancestral worship can also be performed in the Chinese section of the White Hills Cemetery, heritage listed for being a substantially intact example of a mid-19th century cemetery and, as Lee has observed, one of the few Gold Rush era Chinese burial grounds in Australia to retain its original Chinese character and ambience, which includes a burning tower. There's also the Chinese section of the old Bendigo cemetery, which is the final resting place of many of Bridge Street's former storekeepers and their families. And visitors, when they pay their respects, they might be paying respects to their own ancestors, but international Chinese visitors will come and they go and they're paying respects more generally and symbolically to the Chinese who arrived from the gold rush onwards for Bendigo, but across Victoria, across Australia, across the world. We now know that there are 3 surviving Qing era processional dragons in Victoria. The one at the Golden Dragon Museum, the one at the Gold Museum in Ballarat, and there's one in the Siap Temple in South Melbourne. There's a certain competitiveness and a certain discussion about which was the first, which was the oldest. And while, obviously this has its importance, what really interests me is that these communities were large enough in each of these places to raise the funds to purchase a dragon, and that there was something about that point in time in Victoria, because it really only happened in Victoria, that within a few years, within a very short period of time, all these dragons were purchased. And to my mind, the fact that we have these 3 dragons, which are like siblings almost, they each strengthen the significance of the other. They don't diminish. They're not in competition. This is about a bigger, richer story that we can all celebrate. And similarly, with the Qing dynasty processional regalia, and I should note that there was a previous significance assessment that was done just of the processional regalia, so I didn't cover that in as much detail in my report. So this Qing dynasty processional regalia, even individual items within it have incredibly high historic, aesthetic, research, social and spiritual significance, and it's all enhanced by this very rich provenance, rarity, completeness, condition, strong interpretive capacity. It ticks all those boxes. But for me, what is more significant is that this Qing era regalia is part of a multi-generational collection of regalia. As new sets of dragons and lions and regalia were purchased by the community has sought to both replicate earlier designs and copy them and to keep traditions, but they've also drawn on new fabrics and new technologies, and they've invented new traditions. As Doug mentioned, women can parade now, like this. Things have changed, and this is a living and a dynamic collection, and I think it's that bigger picture which is key. So finally, I am concluding. I believe there's no single collection in Australia that's able to provide the depth of insight into a Chinese community as large as Bendigo's in the detail that it does, and over such an extended time period. This doesn't diminish the significance of other Chinese Australian collections, I hate to say it, which have their own significance too. The Golden Dragon Museum's collection has a national significance for the deep understanding of Bendigo's Chinese community that it offers. And this helps us to understand, as we've discussed, the histories of Chinese communities around Australia and internationally. These histories, I think, all ultimately help us to better appreciate who we are as Australians. Thank you.
Thanks. Please put your hands again together for Sophie. And a very, just making a few notes, magical was one of the words you used, which, when you think about what the association does at Easter, it really is that, it's the magic of all those people working together to make the dragon come alive for the Easter parade. And we'll be doing that again with, I think this year, no less than 8 visiting associations or line teams and schools coming to the Easter Fair this year, so look out. So thanks again, Sophie. Our last speaker our speaker for the last session this morning is Mr. Lee McKinnon. Lee McKinnon will be well known to a lot of you local people here, and he's been the research officer at the Golden Dragon Museum for over 10 years. I think we were talking yesterday, like 12 years, up to 12 now. Yep.
Zodiac cycle.
Yeah, there you go, a full zodiac cycle. Very well, good analogy. He's had long-standing research interest in processional collections and practices in the Chinese diaspora. This interest has seen him travel to visit collections and communities across Australia and internationally in New Zealand, Hong Kong, Canada and the United States. He's a published author and a very deep well of knowledge here at our very own Golden Dragon Museum. So please welcome Lee for his presentation, Loong, Communities and Context. Thank you, Lee.
Okay, so a bit of a hard act to follow from my 2 colleagues, but anyway, so in 20 minutes I'll try and do a bit of a gallop through some significant points about Loong and the communities he came from, the traditions behind him, and the community he's still a part of today. All themes that could probably take up several hours, but say 20 minutes. So, Loong, communities and context. One thing that I've tried not to commit death by PowerPoint here, but there is a wealth of photographic material, thankfully, available on Loong. This photo was taken in 1923, so Easter exactly 100 years ago. Now, Loong comes from a cultural context, Cantonese origins, Pearl River Delta. The photo to the right there is the only photo I've ever been able to find of a Qing dynasty dragon parading in the Chinese mainland, from the collection of the Presbyterian Research Centre in Dunedin, of all places. So the photo is taken in Guangzhou. Foshan or Fatshan seems to traditionally be regarded as the home of Cantonese dragon making, so a city on the Pearl River Delta. And in the 20th century, a lot of those craft traditions seem to have migrated to Hong Kong. Now, so in the Pearl River Delta, by the time of the late Qing, there had developed a dragon dance tradition, and unfortunately we seem to know very little about that developmental period. Of large and elaborately decorated processional dragons. There doesn't seem to be anything quite like it in other regions of China. Certainly a dragon dance in other regions, but not on that scale. They formed a part of local village and town festivities, and also sometimes, interestingly, apparently both a source and an expression of village rivalry, according to one source. So in some ways, some things haven't changed in Australia. No. So they not only had an important role in the folkways and belief systems of many Cantonese communities, but they were also, as physical objects, were produced by specialised workshops of highly skilled artisans. And today that particular art form, which is practiced by makers of dragons and lions and other ceremonial items, the Chinese term, or the Mandarin pronunciation, is zazuo, which basically translates as tying work. So that's a type of craft that produces those dragons and similar ceremonial objects. And it's today it's practiced still in Guangdong, in Hong Kong and Macau and other parts of the diaspora, in Malaysia, even North America. There might be one or two people who do it in Australia. Now, Maker's Marks, unfortunately, again, we know very little about those workshops. We only identified, at least as far as I know, 2 workshops. One of those is Sing Chung, which was the maker of our Loong. And through historical photographs, we've been able to find, as you can see here, the California dragon, or the Los Angeles dragon, also made by Sing Chung. That was a dragon that was used in the 1890s and early 20th century in the Los Angeles Golden Dragon Parade. And also the dragon at Rock Springs, Wyoming on the right. And that dragon is, well, both of those dragons are not extant, but the Rock Springs, Wyoming, it's only the glass eyeballs that survive today. So, yeah, we know of at least 3 from the Sing Chung workshop. It wouldn't surprise me if Ballarat's was, but we don't have a maker's mark on the back of his head. No photos that we've been able to find, but a lot of the details are so similar to Loong, it would seem very likely that that was also from the Sing Chung workshop. So you have 3, possibly 4 diaspora dragons that all came from the same workshop. And the Sea Up Society dragon comes from a different workshop. It's a slightly smaller head than some of the Sing Chung dragons that we know of. And it's the Suijing workshop, also from Foshan. So they're all workshops from Foshan. Dragons in the diaspora, as sort of Sophie mentioned, some communities were very much into dragons and others weren't. There is quite a bit of photographic records and even film footage from 1900 of dragons in Vietnam. So amongst the diaspora community in Vietnam, certainly the dragon tradition was very strong. Also North America, a photo of, again, the Los Angeles dragon, and also the dragon on the right is Loong, who we'll come back to a little bit later. Loong is the dragon from Marysville, north of Sacramento in California's Gold Country, and he still survives largely intact. He's possibly from as far back as 1889. And his community still has a living dragon tradition around the Bok Kai Festival, which was just held last weekend, actually. So has been held for about 130 years. And this is perhaps where death by PowerPoint comes in. A bit of an overview and some important dates. So Bendigo, or Dai Gam San. So that's the Chinese characters up there. Dai Gam San, the Big Gold Mountain, as it's usually translated, or perhaps Great Goldfield. There's a number of ways you could sort of slight nuances in the translation, is the traditional Chinese name for Bendigo. And of course, Bendigo, 1851, the gold rush, 1854, large-scale migration of Chinese to the goldfields and to Bendigo. 1855, the peak goldfields population of around 5,000 people in the Chinese community. 1867 was the first full-scale Chinese parade, and that was, again, what Kia showed the Castlemaine version of to welcome Prince Alfred. And then 1871, first Bendigo Easter Fair, 1879, first Chinese Parade Carnival. Again, those important Goldfields connections, all the costumes for that first carnival and banners were borrowed from Beechworth. 1882, the Parade Brigadier collection, which was very much a community effort. Almost 1,000 members of the local Chinese community donated money to buy that founding collection. And that was basically how subsequent collections and editions, such as the first dragon in 1892, were purchased as well. 1895 are the earliest photographs that we have of the Easter Fair. The dragon in those photographs is not Loong. He's in some ways quite different. The horn on his head points the opposite way. He has no mirror on his forehead as well. 1898 is the last time that he appears in the photographic record. 1900, there's the moon-faced dragon. He only is used for a year and then disappears also from the photographic record. And 1901 is when Loong begins to appear in the first photographs, and there's also a record of a new dragon in the Bendigo community. 1911, as has been mentioned, fire destroys Loong's warehouse at the Ironbark Chinese village. There is some conflicting evidence as to where he was stored and to who had custody of him at that time. One report suggests it was the Tungjang Society, a society of people from, Dongjiang Society, Dongguan and Jiangseng in the Pearl River Delta, that they kept the dragon at that time. And then 1915, Chinese Association opens in Bridge Street, and that's officially a new home for Loong. And basically, it's his home is on that site until the present day. With a brief hiatus when the Golden Dragon Museum was being built. I think he was up at the Tom Flood, was he, Doug? Yeah. Yes. And then 1970, Loong retires from annual parading. 1991, another new home for Loong. Golden Dragon Museum opens. 2019, Loong's last parade. Association, first and foremost, is, I suppose, the inner community, the most important community with Loong. And so performance traditions, something we were talking about yesterday with a delegation from Singapore about the importance of the intangible cultural heritage that comes with Loong. And you can see that in some of these photos, that the rituals, the traditions, the performance traditions up on the left, the dressing the dragon, putting him together, which was once a yearly ritual as well, with George Gong, who used to have charge of the dragon. And also the blessing of the dragon, Wong Loong, on the top right, again being performed by George Gong in the Chinese Association rooms. And then you can see him exiting from the association rooms in a very spectacular way, which the dragon used to do out through the main doorway of the association. So he was physically looked after by people such as George Gong, before him Percy Weehee, and that has continued on through to the present day, through and Meg and Holly will talk more about some of the conservation that's been done, but volunteer conservators in before the museum was built in the 1990s, the restoration work in 2001, and then of course Jude Shachinger from 2012 onwards, and then Grim Wade and the BCA volunteers more recently. So there is and I think you can see the care and the respect in which he's been treated over the years, how that's really responsible for the marvellous condition that he's still in today, and that we still have a dragon to work with and to conserve. And then the aspect of faces in the crowd and dragon legs. So the dragon isn't only, it's not just the Chinese Association, but also a wider audience of, so the crowds at the Easter Fair, and also people who take part at the behest of the Chinese Association as well, to carry the dragon, to bring him to life every year. So from the time the dragon first appeared in 1892, the dragon has sort of become the main feature of the Easter Fair. And also its main draw card, its emblem, and over time also even an emblem of the city itself. That often, even though Bendigo was the golden city, in the recent decades he's also been known as the Dragon City as well. So that the Dragon Parade, as part of the Chinese parade at Easter, has also become part of the city's identity and part of the conception of what's special about Bendigo over time. The dragon carriers that by the 1930s, the Chinese Association was also inviting members of the wider community outside of the association to help carry the dragon. And you can see in some of the photos here, some of them, I'm not sure that people will be allowed to do that today with Loong, but you know, charmingly taken by Dennis O'Hoy back in Loong's last annual parade in 1970, those two peeking out there. And so that's also part of the memory of a lot of Bendigo people, that they were literally part of the dragon. And that's something very powerful in the memory of the town and people who come from Bendigo, whether they're of Chinese background or not. And when I talk to descendants of Bendigo Chinese whose family has moved away, that's often something that sometimes it's almost the only thing that they remember about their family's time in Bendigo, that their father or their grandfather carried the dragon or used to chase the tail of the dragon. That was something a lady I talked to in Salt Lake City, Margot Butler, that her father was originally from Bendigo, of Chinese background, the RQ family, and that was something that he always said, that he was a Bendigo boy and he used to chase the tail of the dragon in the parade as a boy. And also to the wider community, wider Australian community, that Loong was something of an ambassador and travelled widely around. 1901 in Federation, which is of course the photo that's the photo used on our marketing for this event, and the badging, but also some of these other communities. Castlemaine, at least in 1902, and that's probably a bit of an abridged list. That Castlemaine used to have, again, a charity parade, raise money for the Bendigo Hospital every New Year's Day. So a bit like the Easter Fair, and the Bendigo Chinese community would assist. 1918, Melbourne, the Our Boys Parade to raise funds and support the troops in World War I. 1922, the Echuca Hospital Gymkhana, and he returned in 1929, and that's actually where we have our earliest footage of Loong from that hospital event as well. He went to Gippsland to sail, 1923, 1924 to Albury, and 1929 to Adelaide. So for all of those events, they'd pack him up in his those sturdy wooden boxes that we still have in our archives, and put him on a train and send him off to his destination. And usually there'd be quite a bit of coordination with the Chinese community in those places. So that's also part of a network of those different communities, some of them in country and rural areas, with Bendigo, and to add something special to their own local fundraising. So almost all of those are fundraising parades that Loong went to. So 1929 was his last outing until 2001. So he had a bit of a rest for a long period. And 2001, you can see it's both charming and perhaps slightly horrifying of Loong going down the escalator at Melbourne Museum. So Loong, as one of the few surviving artefacts from the Federation Parade in 1901, was invited back, and that was the occasion for the conservation and restoration work that was done in 2000, 2001. And he went on parade through Melbourne for the centenary, and that was his last trip outside of Bendigo. But he certainly had a long history of being a travelling dragon before that. So again, as sort of an audience and a community, he was not only important for the Chinese Australian community as a dragon that could be used by their own local community and borrowed from Bendigo, but also as a representative of Chinese culture in a number of communities, just like he was in Bendigo. And then an emerging heritage community. So over the last decade, I've perhaps become a dragon spotter, been slightly obsessed with what's out there, what else survives. And that's led me to the United States 3 times. And but so some of the dragons that we have here, the bits and pieces, and perhaps the state that these dragons are in. When you consider Loong as presented as a complete dragon, I think you can see the importance of Loong amongst the surviving dragons that are still out there. So some of the scales of the Ballarat dragon. Ballarat dragon 1897, Grimwade worked on that dragon before they worked on Loong. The scales are not in great condition and certainly not a full set. So the head, the scales, he's flaming pearls. He has 2 of those, still survive. But yeah, the body is sadly lacking. The Marysville, California dragon, a head, a tail, most of his scales. They're his beads, but no skin, no skirt. And so they are unable or still thinking of ways to present him perhaps more fully. But at the moment it's his head and his 2 flaming pearls that are also on display. So the Marysville dragon, as I mentioned earlier, he's part of a community that still has a living dragon parade tradition. He's known as Loong, the dancing dragon, also as Loong, the golden dragon as well. And he was retired in the 1930s, so he had less of a parading life, less long parading life than Loong. And when I first saw him, basically his jaw was collapsed. That was back in 2013. He was not in good shape. And then they did their own restoration and conservation work. It was done by a pair of lion makers that reside in California. So so it wasn't done by a conservation lab like Grimwade, but it was done by people who are trained in that tradition of Zatwa, of the lion and dragon making. And so they restored his jaw and brought him back to something looking like how he used to. In 2020, they opened their own museum, and that museum is basically based around the temple in which the dragon is housed. And we've been in contact with that Marysville community for probably about 11 or 12 years. Green River, Wyoming, a much more isolated community out in the back blocks of sort of literally the Wild West. The local museum has Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid as part of their local history. And just the eyeballs remaining. Apparently he was ceremonially burnt in 1913, and it was actually a European American who souvenired the eyeballs. And now it's become, I think it was one of the top 10 historical artefacts of Wyoming. They had a poll or something. So the eyeballs are there. You can just see in that photo of how the dragon used to look like. possibly he might even be one of my favourite dragons. Don't tell Loong, when he was in prime condition. And recently they had a post on their Facebook. It was actually while I was on long service leave, but I still saw it. That mentioning about his brother in Australia in Bendigo. So there's also, we've established a relationship there. And then, of course, the Sea Up Society dragon. Now, I do have photos I've taken personally and with permission of the dragon as he is now, but I did not have permission to share them more widely. So I've just used a stand-in photo of the dragon as he appeared in 1901 at the parade alongside Loong. So there were two dragons in that parade at Federation in May 1901, and both of them still exist. But the Melbourne dragon, the Sea Up Society dragon, is only, as far as we know, the head. I don't think there seems to be any evidence that anything more of him survives. But that head is seems to be fairly unretouched, which makes him a very valuable example from his era. So we have a community, sort of talking about communities, a community of dragon legacies, of people who are like our own community and the Bendigo Chinese Association, who are the guardians of what remains of those makers in Foshan in the late Qing dynasty. And then continuing traditions. So, of course, the intangible traditions, the rituals still take place every year. But also, and it's been touched on before, some of those craft traditions are sort of retrofitting new dragons in the style of a Qing dynasty dragon. That the photo at the top left is Mrs. Loong at the Loong Gay Workshop in Hong Kong in 1969. And for the first time, she's making dragon scales. And because by that stage, no one made dragon scales for dragons. They're basically a sort of printed pattern on the skirts. So, and that was at the behest of the Bendigo Chinese Association to create a new dragon, which became Sun Loong, that matched the style and the magnificence of Loong as he was made in the Qing dynasty. Now, of course, in many ways, Sun Loong is a dragon of his time, of 1969, 1970, but he also has those features and some of those elements that were no longer being done at that time by dragon craftsmen. So Mr. Loong had to accommodate those wishes and create a dragon in Sun Loong that is both of its time, but also looking back to the Qing dynasty. And then, of course, Daigam Loong is much in the same vein. And the project, Dragon Project, led by Anita Jack, and going to Hong Kong, looking for a dragon maker that could again do what Mr. Loong had done in 1969, 1970. And so that process was followed through again, and Master Hoi Ga Hung and his workshop were able to again replicate those scales, even though they're even further removed from that tradition than was Master Loong. And perhaps a bit cheekily, I've put Dai Loong there as well, from Melbourne. And I think there is some of the DNA of Loong and Sun Loong in Dai Loong as well, and the Millennium Dragon, that it's perhaps, well, it's not a coincidence, I don't think, that the only other place other than Bendigo that has a large traditional style Cantonese dragon with the individual handmade scales is Melbourne, 150 kilometres down the road. And I think that there's that rivalry. Of course, the famous story of how Dai Loong was made to be longer than Sun Loong, and then BCA and Bendigo businessmen raised money to have an extension made for Sun Loong within the year that he was once again the longest dragon, and now the Millennium Dragon's the biggest and ours is the longest. So I think we're happy with that. That Loong is, I think, again, this special situation in southeastern Australia and Victoria. I think Loong's DNA is in our unusually traditional style of dragons in Bendigo and Melbourne as well. So I think I'll stick to time, and so that's just an overview, a bit of scene setting of Loong, his context and his communities. So I know there's much more and probably could be said much better, but thank you.
And look, I'll kick things off if that's all right, but one of the things, I suppose, is that we have this extant, a full version of a imperial processional dragon in Bendigo, which is over 120 years old. And I suppose the first question is, I know you've touched on it, but what's the reason? How do you think? What's the main reason that Loong has survived so long and in such great condition, Lee?
Oh dear. Okay. I think it's perhaps down to, at times, only a very few committed individuals. There's people, the late Jan O'Hoy amongst them, and perhaps other places weren't as lucky to have individuals like that at some critical times. So that's, I guess, my very simple and succinct answer to that. And and of course the community itself and their pride in the dragon and keeping it as an intact piece and also as part of a living tradition. Yeah. Yes, anyone?
Thanks, Lee. And just following on from that, just briefly, we had a Singaporean delegation, you said, and one of the things we spoke about was actually how Loong was originally funded, and perhaps it might be interesting for people to know here how that happened. You mentioned, almost 1,000 people, I think, was it, for Loong?
Well, that was for the regalia collection, but I think it was very much a similar process for Loong. And of course, Sun Loong and Dai Gum Loong also had that element of community funding as well. So that's also another continuing aspect. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Lee. Questions from the audience? Thank you.
Lee, can I just ask you, when you said it was funded by the community,
Yes.
what records ever kept with food?
All right. Okay, so for the reason why I mentioned the costume collection particularly is that we're lucky that everyone was acknowledged in the Bendigo Advertiser in 1882. So the Chinese committee actually published the names of everyone. It's almost 1,000 names. So, and with the money that they contributed. So that is a pretty complete record, divided though into Siap people, Jiangseng people, and then weirdly people from Echuca. So it's but everyone's acknowledged. Yeah.
The same didn't happen for Loong?
No.
No records at all?
There's no internal records that survive in the association, and I don't think there's anything that was published at the time either. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, you mentioned Echuca then, Lee, and I was just thinking the first question. Is it true that that after the rushes that the Chinese community broke back to certain areas, and one was Bendigo and the other one, I guess, was Chinatown in Melbourne?
So, I guess, so you mean sort of consolidated or, yeah. I suppose, and Echuca as well. Echuca had a small Chinatown, and the tragedy there is that their hall is now the McDonald's, but about as bad a heritage outcome as possible. But yeah, certainly Bendigo was very much became a local hub. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you see happening is actually an urbanisation of everyone. There's not something particular happening with the Chinese community, but everybody is moving into cities for employment, and so these towns become hubs. But then, as the White Australia policy and immigration restrictions kick in, and as people start to blend into inter-community, those Chinese centres shrink and become less significant.
More questions from the floor?
Why isn't Loong given a name? Because the other one is
Dragon.
Dragon.
Yes, I guess, yeah. Yes, I'd say that Loong is probably more the rule and the others are the exception, as in, well, in terms historically,
There's one before.
yes, but often they're kind of referred to simply as Gumlung, Golden Dragon. I mean, even Loong was known to some people as Mulung, just like the one in Marysville, the Dancing Dragon, but they're more descriptions. And Sun Loong is simply the new dragon. And I've heard Dennis O'Hoy say the Sun Loong. And then I suppose, particularly as you get a collection of them, you have to start differentiating them.
And probably the idea that that they have a name is something that evolves over time. As you say, as you get more of them, they start having names, whereas it's probably more descriptive initially. So, it's a dragon.
I think because of its size, the Chinese would just refer to as Dailong, which is, the big dragon.
The big dragon.
Yes, yeah.
And that's, it's just odd because as a Chinese name, you wouldn't call someone with a single name.
Yes.
Sort of short. That's why you have the Youngs, whoever.
Yes.
It's like, there's something missing.
Yeah. Well, again, in Chinese, I think he was often referred to as Gumlung. Yeah, Mulong. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was really curious about the spiritual significance assessment. How to do one? What's the framework for assessing spiritual significance? That's part A of my question. Part B is what the hell is going on with the dragon, the Chinese mythological creature at Easter on land that is Indigenous Australian. So there's a very crowded spiritual realm.
Well, it was a liminal moment. Anything was possible in the 1860s.
Thank you, Deborah. I didn't work off anything as formal as a framework in thinking about the spiritual significance, and in a sense, it comes from, a gut feeling. You can see how Doug speaks about the dragon and how people who engage with him, how they respond, and you can feel it as something that can only be described as spiritual, that is a little bit intangible. And magic is not the best word, but I haven't been able to, there's a better word to describe what that feeling is. And that's not to deny that the other dragons, in Melbourne, whatever, that people don't feel special about them. But I think there is actually something a little bit more that goes on, and that was part of what I was drilling down to kind of find out about. And then, it's a fundraising event at Easter is probably a better way to think about it. It's not a celebration of Easter. It's a way to raise money for hospitals, and Chinese have a very strong philanthropic tradition, across the world in terms of donating to hospitals.
Thanks, Sophie. Just to jump in, Deb, thank you for that comment. I do think it's a pretty busy spiritual agenda. But can I just offer it more, not so much in the spiritual context, but in terms of intangible and identity, and for me, somebody who's grown up 38 k's from here and went to school here and has family roots, I've always identified with the Golden Dragon Museum since the 90s, but even before it was announced. I've always known that there was the Bendigo Easter parade, and I've always seen it as a bit of a cultural marker, and I do and continue to do so. So for me, it's actually intangibly, it's one of those sort of cultural signifiers of the region, and I can't sort of add a spiritual dimension to it, but knowing that the Loong's in good shape and being conserved, knowing that the museum is there, knowing that the procession is still happening, and knowing that there is a dragon that's, well, I think it's internationally significant. That for me has a lot of emotional meaning and currency, more than perhaps I thought about until I got here last night, reflecting on what was going to happen today. So I don't know if that's religious, but it's certainly intangible heritage, and it's certainly something that's transmitted in my family across generations.
Thank you, Kia. You demonstrated that spiritual significance very nicely.
2 more questions.
Just following on from what Sophie said earlier, and I'd never thought about this, but Easter was always a homecoming for our family back to Bendigo from the dispersed families. So it was interesting. But to me, I'm intrigued to know what the motivation you found out was for the ceremonial burning of the Green River Wyoming dragon.
All right. Yes. Well, perhaps according to tradition, it probably should happen to every dragon, but
We messed up.
yes. Apparently, and I can't speak to the quality of the source, but the community at, Green River's where it is now because it's the county seat, but it was the Rock Springs community. The community at Rock Springs, this was after the revolution that overthrew the Manchu dynasty, and apparently they were in a modernising mood, and that was that. Anyway, that's the story. That's what part of what they did. Yeah.
Just 2 more questions.
Yeah.
No, that's it.
The first part, I guess, comment. Have you considered the fact that Easter is based on the lunar calendar and that Christianity doesn't have a monopoly on that?
No. Yeah.
The second part is, what are the consequences, or have you considered the consequences from that sort of Taoist perspective of not following through that tradition of burning the dragon at the end of its life? I'm not suggesting any Bendigo's dragon's lives have ended, but you've got other examples such as the Sea Up dragon, the one in Ballarat, whose lives do appear to have ended, they're not fully intact. How does that fit with the tradition?
Traditions change.
Yes.
I think...
Yes.
I mean, I think that's,
Yeah.
And I think, Sophie, you touched on that in your talk about, history and tradition. I mean, history is obviously is what happens, but also history created by the practices that you instigate or think over a period of time. And I guess from that point of view, we're very lucky that we've sort of bucked, some parts of the culture, if you know what I mean, to end up with what we've ended up with.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to ask is, what does that look like through the eyes of someone who's from China and still sees things according to the old tradition?
Okay, kind of going, I think we can also flip this the other way. We're working from the assumption that, traditions have to stay the same. And I think that one of the things that the Golden Dragon Museum has done has created a sense that we need to save all of these dragons because that's happened, and this tradition for caring and completing for, holding the whole dragons. And I think that what we've seen with the other examples is that the communities have not seen the need to keep a whole dragon. And, that's okay too. They're beautiful dragons, and I'm very pleased that Bendigo has kept their dragon. But, material culture is material culture. Sorry, what was your second comment?
It was about Taoism.
Well, if it's a tradition to scene attraction?
Oh, it was about what would the reality about these traditions is that they're probably most strongly kept here and in the diasporic communities than they are in mainland China or Hong Kong. And so, to be perfectly, I might be speaking a bit out of turn, but it could be that somebody from mainland China wonders why you've kept an old dragon. You know, not that those traditions.
I do wonder also if best practice cultural heritage and management conservation runs into cultural practice. And I think it happens more often than you think, and maybe you've just hit that fault line there. So what might be best in terms of what the Grimwade's doing and what the museum's doing? And I'm glad for it, because having the oldest dragons in the world, whether it's here or wherever, but certainly within Victoria, speaks to something that that hasn't happened elsewhere. I think it's unbelievable that they're here, to be honest with you. So the flip side, so that's the positive. The negative is, has traditional cultural life and practice been observed? Has it been committed back to wherever it's supposed to go? Yeah, that's an issue, but it's not for me, coming in from where a heritage had, it's not that unusual. It's just a tension, a dynamic to be negotiated by various stakeholders. Sorry. Oh, no, not at all.
I think what we had was priceless.
Sorry, Holly has a...
Holly?
So it's just a comment, actually, that I can think of lots of conservation similarities. One is colours. The flags that were held in war, and they're meant to fall apart over time, and cultural institutions do keep them alive through conservation. Another is possum skin cloaks. Possum skin cloaks were from birth to death, and they went to, well, people were buried with their cloaks. The tradition was lost because of lots of reasons with colonisation, and they made again now. It's a similar kind of thing, that things were made to last, and conservation is a modern construct of our society today that makes things last longer, which, you know, the ones involved feel very strongly about, but I don't believe everything's made to last. But I also rejoice that Loong is here.
Yeah.
But there is lots of cultural similarities in all cultures.
And collecting is a very Western thing.
Right. And conservation started off as a very Western thing. Cabinets of curiosity.
We're not having a conversation about authenticity, are we now?
Okay, so one last quick question from Ted.
Deborah had one as well, sorry.
No.
So we're just going to be, we're a bit over time now, so we'll just take one last question. Let's go.
I just want to follow up on that before I ask the question. Is that I'm someone who lives the culture. In that Chinese, with this processional thing, traditionally don't keep them, they don't name them. If they get old, they get damaged, they burn them and then replace them. The reason that in Australia, well, in America, in faraway country from China where it was built, the cost of replacing them and the trouble to go to replacing is very difficult. So it survived, and luckily it survived in that sense. One other comment, by 1969, Bendigo, the Easter with Loong, was basically just Easter time. The Chinese community nowadays, 365 days a year, that's what we like to say. And there's only one group of people, and none of them are Chinese. There are 5 people. I don't know if anybody here realized that the Loong 100 Committee actually is the reason for the renaissance, or whatever the term is, for what we have today with the Golden Dragon Museum. And those 5 people really are very important, because they are the one who brought Sun Loong. And they are 5 very prominent people. My question, probably to all of you, is that Lee spoke in before, during that period between 1889 to 1901, there was Loong, there was Loong in Ballarat, Loong in Bendigo, and then all those other dragons, they look quite similar. Why did that happen in that period of 10 or 20 years?
What a question.
Yeah, I was talking with Tan about that before, and it's something that I've posed myself to other people, something I've noticed. But I'm not sure that I'm any closer to a to an answer. So I might hand over to my more esteemed historical colleagues here.
I'm prepared to give a stab at it, but I think we still need to explore it a bit more. I think there's a few things going on. Certainly, by the late 19th century, you've got Chinese communities that are, despite the immigration restrictions that have happened, the communities are quite large. So Melbourne's Chinatown, for example, reaches its biggest extent in the early 20th century.
And thrives.
And thrives, yeah. That's right. And it's also at this point that you have multiple generations. So you've got second generation Chinese Australians in white collar jobs, not working as market gardeners. So you've also got more money flushing around. You've got post-gold rush money floating around. You've got Australia coming together as a nation. You've got people thinking reflecting identity, and the Chinese community seeking respectability and recognition for what they do. And those parades are well respected in the community. And so that's my answer.
I think you've answered it.
I was going to say, Kia, any last remarks from Kia? All right. No?
We're the experts.
Okay. So
Thanks,
Great question.
yeah. Yes, thank you. Look, this, I think, even just this last conversation about Loong is just, a great culmination of this whole project, which has gone for the last 18 months or 2 years. I'm not quite sure when that first seed of a phone call was made, but this is a fantastic outcome. I mean, it's not finished. We've got the afternoon session to come, but I just touch on a few words. Both personally, I think, and hopefully I can speak on behalf of the Chinese associations about the one word belonging that Kia used earlier on. If you look at my ancestry DNA file, I think I'm 50% Irish, and 25, 50%, and a quarter Scottish, and the rest, and the other 25% is Chinese, or a little bit of it. But I suppose this is something that's it comes down through the generations, and you get that. So I equate, or I feel more Chinese than I feel Irish. So, but that's just the way it is. The other one was, and Sophie said, magic. Maybe not the word, but there is that feeling when you get around our dragons. I get it around Loong. I get it around because I grew up more with Sunlong. I feel that, and I'm sure everybody who gets involved feels that when we bring the dragon to life at Easter and accomplish what we do. And it's that, again, it's that tradition right the way through of raising funds for Easter for the hospitals, which can continue right through to the present day. And of course, then there's that, you feel like that community and also a social obligability that Lee meant, he meant to mention the obligation, but it's that being, there being that main draw card at Easter is we see as a very big responsibility, just for the community. And as our past president, Russell Jack, AM, always says, everyone at Easter is Chinese in Bendigo. So on that note, could I please get you to warmly welcome our three speakers this morning, Kia, Sophie and Lee. Thank you for your attention, and go and enjoy your lunch wherever that may be, and we'll be back with you at 1 p.m. sharp. Thank you very much.